The Himalayas, a Sanskrit word for the land of snow, are home to some of the most majestic and exceptional snow-clad valleys, rivers, lakes, and meadows. However, they also boast some of the tallest and most dangerous peaks of the world. Thousands of climbers have tried their luck on these mysterious peaks, and James Scott was one of them. James Scott was a medical student from Australia who arrived in Nepal to fill a post in the local hospital. While waiting for the position to be vacated, he decided to climb in the nearby Himalayan mountain range, featuring the world's highest elevations. While enjoying a thrilling climb, 10,000 feet above sea level, Scott suddenly found himself stranded by a heavy blizzard that left him with no food or drink. It was day 40. Scott felt dizzy. He could not stand up or think clearly. He was exhausted, like he had never been before. He sucked on a small icicle in a desperate attempt to take his mind off the terrible hunger and weakness that overcame him. The long days without proper nourishment left Scott painfully thin and haggard. He knew that his hours in this world were numbered. His greatest regret was that his family would be upset to lose him. All those years he had invested in the study of medicine were now going to waste before he even had an opportunity to put his knowledge to use. With his last ounce of strength, Scott tried, gathering a bit of snow to drink as he had done so many times before. Now, however, his body was too cold to melt the snow into water. Instead, the snow and ice he put in his mouth just stuck. Scott crawled back into his sleeping bag and remained inside, motionless. He had given up. Join us as we discover what happened next in the world's wildest mountains.
It all happened in the winter of 1991. James Scott was then a 22-year-old student from Brisbane in Eastern Australia. He had another year before he would graduate medical school. In keeping with regulations for medical students, he was required to work for a year without pay before he could graduate. After considering many options, Scott chose to go to Nepal, a land in South Asia sandwiched between India and China. The snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas that run through Nepal were a strong attraction for Scott. When Scott arrived in Nepal's capital city, Kathmandu, at the end of 1991, his post had not yet been vacated by the outgoing doctor. Scott decided to use his free time to visit the nearby peaks together with his friend Tim Hooper. Hooper was a fellow medical student from Australia who had come to Nepal together with Scott. The pair bought themselves a full complement of climbing equipment and warm clothes. Several days later, they set out to climb the nearby hills. They settled on the Halambu Trek, a relatively easy hike through the mountains that climbed no more than 10,000 feet. On the first night of their trek, the pair enjoyed a full moon that illuminated the mountain peaks. They decided to settle down for the night in the first guest house they reached. At the guest house, they met a small group of German mountain climbers who advised them against the path and told them they should take the Gesindkook trek. They described to the two medical students the beautiful rivers that flowed nearby and the breathtaking waterfalls created by the melting mountain snows. The Germans told Scott and Hooper that at the moment there was no snow or ice along the Gesindkook Way. It was the perfect time to set out on that trip. But they also warned them that the moment it began snowing, they had to head back. The Germans offered the Australian pair a new map that provided clear information all about the Gesindkook Trail. The next morning, the two friends prepared to head along the Gesindkook Way and met Mark Fulton, a fellow Australian. They described the beautiful scenery of the trek to him, and he decided to change his plans and join them as well. The three Australians now set out together on the trek. They had gone just a few hours when Tim Hooper twisted his foot. He was forced to drop out of the trip. Scott and Hooper had brought along only one lighter between the two of them. It was in Hooper's backpack. Hooper also had the original, reliable map the pair had brought. James Scott had taken with him only a sleeping bag, extra clothes, books, and 2 chocolate bars. These proved to be fatal mistakes. Scott and Fulton went ahead with the hike. They hiked up the trail all day and were approaching an elevation of 10,000 feet as night fell. The temperature dropped. It was time to stop at a guest house for the night. The next day, the Australian pair continued up the trail. After hours of trekking, they reached a fork. Right led to the Halambu trek, the trail Scott and Hooper had originally planned to take. Left led to the Gesindkook trek, the trail the Germans had strongly urged them to follow. Scott and Fulton met several climbers returning from the Gesindkook trek, who warned them that it was a difficult hike. The good news, though, was that the trail was clear of snow, and at the moment, the weather was perfect. This was December 21st, 1991. After breakfast, the two travelers set out on the Gesindkook trail. They hiked through the day, following the directions the German tourists had given Scott. They reached Petty, a point about 12,000 feet in elevation. There they spent the night in the guest house, where they were served a warm meal and hot tea. That night the temperature dropped so low that Scott had to sleep in his sleeping bag with his coat on. When that was not enough to keep him warm, he donned a second pair of clothes, gloves, and a woolen sweater. As he slept calmly in the hut, snow began to fall. Scott and Fulton awoke on the morning of December 22nd to find a thin layer of snow coating the path and the roof of the hut. Scott immediately became nervous. Perhaps it was a result of the extreme elevation where the air was thin. It was foggy out, but clear enough to indicate that a snowstorm was in the making. Scott turned to the owner of the guest house and asked for his opinion. Was a snow about to fall? The man reassured him that it is not going to snow. After finishing breakfast, the pair stepped out at 7:30 to face the chilling frost. The trip was a tough one. The Gesindkook trek is extremely steep. In fact, some sections involve a near vertical climb. The map that they had was clearly not top quality. It provided no landmarks along the way. It didn't even show the guest house at Petty where the two had spent the previous night. But that minor problem was soon crowded out by more pressing concerns. Scott began suffering from a headache that grew progressively worse as the day wore on. Half an hour after they had left the guest house, the sky began to cloud over. The air turned colder, and then a light snow began to fall. This unexpected change made Scott very nervous. Within 15 minutes, a thick blanket of heavy, wet snow was falling. Visibility was limited to 30 feet ahead. 5 minutes later, the two found themselves tramping through 4 inches of snow on the ground. Although Scott and Fulton could not make out the path, they assumed that they could just follow the stream that ran alongside the Geseinkund Way. They continued this way for half a mile until they found themselves up against a sheer wall. It was impossible to go any further, so the two Australians made an about-face and headed back. They were completely baffled to suddenly discover that they were now standing on opposite sides of the stream. With each passing minute, Scott's headache grew worse. He was very concerned that he was experiencing altitude sickness. Scott's mind wandered back to the previous June when he had climbed Mount Buller in the southeast Australian state of Victoria. At that mountain's peak stands a monument to a young skier who had become lost in a blizzard. When the body was finally located, the skier was found just 160 feet from a shelter. Scott could not help but wonder whether the guest house at Petty was just 160 feet from where he and Fulton were standing now. At this point, the two trekkers had climbed 1,300 feet. They had another several thousand feet to climb before the way would begin to head back down. Scott's greatest fear was the downhill portion of the trek, since they had no idea what to expect on the other side of the mountain. Scott had not brought along his boots and was completely unprepared to hike through snow. Fulton had his own ideas, though. He firmly declared that they must forge ahead. He was determined to continue the trek at least until 1 p.m. Scott and Fulton argued back and forth for a few minutes. When they could not agree on a course of action, the two decided to split up and go their own ways. After twisting his foot, Tim Hooper had limped his way back down the trail. He returned to Kathmandu on December 25th. Hooper visited the restaurant where he was scheduled to meet James Scott, but Scott did not appear. When Scott did not return the following day or the day after, Hooper began making phone inquiries. Scott's other acquaintances had not heard from him either. On December 27th, Hooper contacted the Australian embassy in Kathmandu to report that his friend had disappeared without a trace. 2 days later, Hooper sent a fax to Scott's father, Professor Ken Scott, a respected chemist in Brisbane. The brief message informed the man that his son James had last been seen on December 20th in Gopti. This was an area in the Himalayas that is at a much lower elevation than Petty, and it was there that Scott had slept over before setting out on the Geseinkund trek. On December 29th, James Scott's older sister, Joanne Robertson, received a phone call from her father. Ken Scott read aloud the fax from Hooper. He remained calm as he explained to his daughter that the snow that had fallen in the Himalayas had apparently begun very suddenly. Hopefully, James had found shelter and was simply stranded in the mountains. He would be waiting for the snow to end before continuing on his way. Joanne Robertson contacted the Australian Foreign Ministry about traveling to Nepal. However, the officials strongly advised against it. They were convinced that James was simply stranded temporarily by the sudden snow. Robertson was reassured that the authorities in Nepal would certainly launch a search operation. The Australian Embassy in Nepal contacted David Schlimm, president of the Himalaya Rescue Organization. He recommended bringing in Carl Harrison, a professional mountain climber who lived in Kathmandu and had led mountain climbing expeditions in the past. Harrison's strong experience and knowledge of the Himalayas made him a top candidate to oversee the search and rescue operation. The first search team set out on December 30th under the direction of Harrison and Inge Schnabel of the Himalayan Rescue Dog Training Center. Officials promised Robertson that they would surely find her brother by January 2nd, 11 days after he had last been seen, probably at a shelter near Gopti. But January 2nd came and went, and there was no news from Nepal. To fully appreciate Scott's predicament, let's consider the Himalayas, which encompass 100 mountains, including 9 of the world's 10 tallest peaks. The highest elevation on Earth, Mount Everest, at 29,092 feet above sea level, is also found in this mountain system. The Himalaya range extends in a band of nearly 16,000 miles through 5 Asian countries. The mountains begin in India in the south and end with Tibet to the north. The towering, pristine white peaks of these mountains have always entranced their observers. The locals named them Himalaya, Sanskrit for adobe of snow. There is so much snow on these mountains that the runoff forms 3 of the world's largest rivers. Collectively, the rivers that descend from the Himalayas provide drinking water for 600 million people. Over the years, many thousands of visitors have come to this range in search of adventure. These peaks hold an exotic attraction because they are the world's tallest. At the same time, the Himalayan mountains are among the world's most dangerous. The extreme altitude presents the first problem. The mountain air is very thin and carries far lower oxygen than most people are used to. Climbers who hope to conquer the peaks are advised to spend a few weeks first at the villages at the base of the mountain range. There they can slowly acclimate to the rarefied air before beginning the strenuous climb. Doctors recommend that people who begin suffering from altitude sickness caused by a fast change in air pressure from climbing be immediately evacuated by helicopter.
The most common altitude sickness is acute altitude sickness, also called acute mountain sickness. Symptoms include headache, dizziness, loss of appetite, and poor sleep. Preventing altitude sickness is easy to do, especially if you know the symptoms or have had it before. So to prevent it, ascend more slowly. Give your body a couple days of slowly going higher in altitude in order to adjust to the changes. Make sure you hydrate well and take it easy while you acclimate. Try to avoid excessive alcohol, as it will nullify the healthy steps you're taking. Lastly, there are medications we can prescribe to help. Preventing altitude sickness is about knowing your body, your medical history, and properly preparing before going to a higher altitude.
Another difficulty that hikers and climbers in the Himalayas must overcome is the extreme cold. During the winter months, the temperature can drop to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30, or even colder. To survive in these conditions, trekkers must wear specialized warm clothes. Avalanches, in which entire mountainsides of snow come crashing hundreds of feet down, are common. Anything unfortunate enough to be trapped in the path of the rush of snow is buried instantly. Because the mountain range is so vast, it is impossible for the local governments to maintain effective control over them. The Hindu Kush Mountains at the western tip of the Himalayas are well known for sheltering Taliban terrorists who are attempting to regain control of Afghanistan. It was here that the Al-Qaeda leaders fled after America invaded Afghanistan in 2002. For hundreds of years, the passes through the Himalayas formed a vital point along the Silk Road trade route that carried Oriental and Asian spices and goods 4,000 miles to the ports of Europe. Many merchants and entrepreneurs paid with their lives for the privilege of carrying their wares along the inhospitable mountain roads. To this day, some of the most dangerous roads in the world are found snaking through the Himalayas. Many of these roads hug the mountainside, and although they are used as two-way streets, they are barely wide enough for a single vehicle. These paths are so long and isolated that it is impossible to install barriers all along the way. One careless turn of the wheel can send the hapless occupants plummeting to certain death hundreds of feet below. Lives are lost every year as vehicles slip off the roads, often because of snow or ice along the path. Back in Brisbane, James Scott's family waited impatiently to hear any news. Joanne Robertson could not get her mind off her brother, who was stranded helplessly somewhere in the wild snowdrifts of the Himalayas. She feared he was freezing to death or dying of hunger. One day, the Australian embassy informed her that the team of rescue workers had met a group of Canadians who said with 99% certainty that they had seen her brother. They were now following up on the information they received from the Canadians and hoped to find James Scott very soon. But the day passed and there was no happy phone call from the Foreign Ministry. On January 3rd, she decided she could not sit by and wait anymore. She would travel to Nepal herself to find out what was being done and why the rescue teams had not found her brother after receiving such clear information. To that end, Robertson headed to the Nepalese embassy in Australia and applied for an entry visa. Her father, Ken Scott, asked James's friend Andrew Ross to accompany Mrs. Robertson to Nepal and help her out. On January 7th, 16 days after James Scott had disappeared, his sister reached Kathmandu. The moment she arrived, she was struck by the extreme poverty in Nepal and the dismal state of the local infrastructure. Without wasting any time, Robertson checked into a hotel and immediately went to inquire about the latest news from the rescue operation. The information she received did little to calm her fears. Carl Harrison had sent his first team to Gopti, the last place Scott was seen by his friend Tim Hooper. But as soon as they arrived, they met a group of Canadians who insisted that they had seen James Scott on the Halambu trek to the southeast. As a result, Harrison had turned the team around and sent them off southeast. Robertson tracked down the Canadians in Kathmandu, and they confirmed that they had definitely seen her brother. One woman, though, seemed doubtful about whether it was him that they had seen. She said that they had spoken briefly to the man, and she had understood that he was from Germany. In any case, the woman seemed unsure, while the rest of the group was very confident about their version of the story. Soon Robertson learned that the head of the rescue team had gotten a notice from a German named Matthias. He had heard that the team was searching for someone on the Halambu Trail, and he was therefore notifying them that a group of Canadians had met him on the way. If they were searching for Matthias, he said, he was doing fine. By now, Robertson was becoming increasingly convinced that the Canadian sighting was based on misinformation. There was no way to be certain until she met Matthias. But she was extremely upset that the rescue team had been diverted from the verified direction based on rumors. She complained to Harrison, who told her that if James was in the Halambu region where they were searching, he may still be alive. But if he was really in Gabde, as the first reports indicated, he would almost definitely have perished in the terrible frost and snow. It had now been 21 days since anyone had seen Scott. Robertson knew her brother had not brought along much food with him, so he had not had anything to eat for the past 21 days. Weather conditions aside, the hope of finding James alive were admittedly growing slim. After Scott and fellow mountain climber Fulton had split up, Scott tried to make his way back to Petty. With the snow covering up his previous tracks, it was impossible to be certain that he was heading the right way. After wandering in this manner for a while, Scott reached a waterfall with an improvised bridge. That was a big boost for his morale, since the bridge indicated that he was on an official trail. Scott located the river on a map and found that it ran until a village named Talu. He decided to cross the bridge and follow the trail along the river until he reached Talu. But after 5 minutes, Scott saw no more sign of the trail he was trying to follow. He was surrounded by sheer cliffs and thorn bushes, a sure sign that he was not on any trail. The path before him went down a steep hill. After a few minutes, he reached an area filled with tall grass and thick pine trees. He hoped this sudden change was a sign that he was nearing a settlement, and he forged on toward what he hoped was Talu. 4 hours later, Scott had to admit that he was not getting anywhere. He stopped and ate 1/4 of one of the 2 chocolate bars he was carrying. While making the dangerous descent down the mountain slope, he had slid on his back, and now Scott found that his clothing was soaked through. Uncomfortable though he was, Scott pressed on. Eventually, he reached a point where the river he was following was joined by several others. He followed the river further until it suddenly reached a waterfall. Scott carefully crawled to the edge and peered over. What he saw chilled him to the bone. He was looking straight down a vertical drop of dozens of feet. Now he was in a dilemma. Should he turn around and head back after spending so many hours following this stream? Scott decided to forge on. This was a very dangerous undertaking, though. The drop was nearly 100 feet, and the snow that continued to fall made the rocks extremely slippery. Scott was only too aware that with one careless slip, he was doomed. Several times he could feel himself beginning to slip and lose control. More than once, he had to catch on to the sheer wall with the tips of his fingers to prevent a free fall. The way down took Scott 2 hours, and by the time he reached the bottom, he was completely drained. Still, it was good to know that he had overcome that difficulty, and so long as his hands and feet continued to function, Scott was now confident that he could find his way out. The snow limited visibility to a maximum of 50 feet. The waterfall and the river it fed were gone. Scott surveyed the scenery around him and noticed a small cave beneath a large cliff. The snow had not found its way inside, so Scott figured it would make a good spot to rest for a short while. When his mind was clear, he would decide what to do next. As a medical student, Scott was aware of the danger of hypothermia. It was critical that he keep his body temperature from dropping too far. His wet clothing presented an immediate danger of frostbite, which could lead to gangrene and even death. So the first thing he did once he was inside the cave was to dry himself with a towel and change into fresh clothes. The second thing he did was to devour another half of his chocolate bar. Next, Scott took out his sleeping bag and curled up inside it. Night was falling, and the bitter cold penetrated into his bones. Inside the warm sack, he quickly fell into a deep sleep, and he knew nothing until he woke up the next morning. When he woke up, he left behind his wet shirt, hoping that a search team would be able to use that article of clothing to provide bloodhounds with his scent. Then they would be able to follow his footprints and track him down. Now Scott began his trek anew, following the stream that he had found the previous night. This was a tricky task, as there was no simple path along the stream. In many places, Scott was forced to jump from one stone to the next. The layer of ice that covered them meant that Scott often slipped and fell right into the stream. There he was treated to a solid thump, and his clothes were soaked by the frigid waters. At 4 p.m., Scott felt his strength waning, and he stopped to nibble on the second chocolate bar. Nearby, he noticed a small hollow beneath a stone. It was far smaller than the cave in which he had spent the night, with only just enough room to lie down inside. He squeezed himself in and then dried himself off, just as he had done the night before. The optimism he had felt the day before was disappearing. In desperation, Scott took a pen and paper from his backpack and began composing a letter to his family. Scott wrote that he was happy to die doing something that he enjoyed. It was a lie, of course, but Scott knew that his disappearance and the subsequent weeks of searching for his body would cause his family much aggravation. He apologized to his parents for dying so young. He was no longer afraid of his death, but Scott did feel deeply responsible for what had happened to him. When he was done, Scott downed the remainder of his last chocolate bar. It didn't make much sense to save food if he was going to die anyway. He could only hope that his newfound friend Mark Fulton had found a way out of the nightmare of the Himalayan blizzard. If Fulton also died, it would weigh on Scott's conscience, since Fulton had only tried the treacherous Gazinkund Trail as a result of his arguments. Joanne Robertson's presence in Kathmandu helped get the rescue operation moving in the right direction. Ads were published in Nepalese newspapers to notify the public that an Australian student was missing. Hundreds of signs were posted around Kathmandu with Scott's photo. The signs stated that the family promised a reward of 20,000 rupees for information leading to Scott alive, or 10,000 rupees if he were found dead. The rescue operation was plagued by trouble, since there were no perfect maps of the mountain passes. Even the names of different locales and landmarks varied from one map to the next. The best information the rescue team had to go on was Tim Hooper's estimation that James Scott had returned to Gopti. In fact, Scott and Fulton had gone far beyond Gopti, reaching all the way to Petty. They had gone even further before the snow had forced them to split up. Andrew Ross, the friend who had accompanied her to assist in the search efforts, got sick from eating the local food. Since there was no official trail leading to Taloo, an isolated mountain village, the rescuers assumed that Scott couldn't have headed there. One day, though, Robertson met a Nepalese mountain guide who informed her that he had once found an unknown path that led down from the Gazainkund Trail to Taloo. Armed with this new information, Robertson contacted the Himalayan Rescue Organization and Carl Harrison. They initially rejected the idea. Robertson refused to give up hope, and she kept pressuring Harrison to search in new areas. Finally, he decided to go back up and look in the direction of Petty. Harrison promised Joanne Robertson that this time he would check through every cave and shelter on the mountain. They would also check every cliff where he may have fallen and check for signs of a body. Scott was surprised when he awoke and opened his eyes to the sun's rays. He found it hard to believe that he had survived the night. He began trekking through the tall snow again, still hoping against hope that he was headed in the right direction. The wandering continued for several hours. Finally, Scott saw an open area ahead of him. If all else failed, at least that would make a great place to be spotted by a helicopter, he thought. Just then, fresh snow began to fall, and Scott's mood plummeted again. Scott had no strength left to fight the snow. Scanning the area, Scott noticed a cave, 10 feet by 15 feet wide, beneath a large stone hill. The stones above and some trees in front protected the mouth of the cave, and it was dry inside. Scott decided to settle down there to rest before he tried going further. When he removed his socks, he saw that his feet had turned blue. He felt no sensation in them. He tried warming them with a towel, but nothing helped. When he had settled down somewhat, he took a look around the cave. It was obvious that he was not the first visitor there. He could see the remains of a fire and several axe handles. As night fell, the temperature dropped and Scott began to shiver violently. He was chilled through and through. For the next few days, Scott remained in place, often hallucinating. He watched the sun rise in the morning and set at night, making way for the moon to rise and set again. He drifted between sleeping and wakefulness, never fully reaching either state. Scott only ventured out of his cave when the sun rose in the morning. He would crawl out of his sleeping bag to collect some snow in a small bag. Then he would return to the warmth of his sleeping bag and press the snow into small cakes. There was plenty of time to study the horizon. Scott calculated that the peak of the mountain was 3,200 feet above him, and that he was only 10 kilometers from Petty. Fortunately, Scott was still able to concentrate enough to read, so he took out a book. In the time it took for a single snowball to melt entirely in his mouth, he could finish reading 2 pages. By the afternoon, the snowballs had melted somewhat and he could suck the water out of them. For the next 10 days, Scott suffered terribly from the gnawing hunger. It was hard to get his mind off the thought of food. With time, though, he learned to control his mind, and that made it much easier for him to go on in his difficult state. He sampled every plant near the cave as a source of nourishment. He tried chewing bamboo shoots and pine needles, but his experience with both of them was discouraging. Scott found a small bush about 3 feet high, which grew something that looked like berries. When he tried them, he found them to be so bitter that it was impossible to use them as food. The snow continued unabated for 10 days, but then the sun finally came out. The snow began to melt and drip down the cliff above the cave in which Scott hid. Still, the snow outside was too high for Scott to leave, so he stayed behind in his shelter. One day, James Scott was awakened suddenly from his afternoon nap by wild voices. The noise was so frightening that his hair stood on end and a cold sweat covered him. He had never in his life heard such sounds. It could have been a child being tortured. Scott's limbs trembled in fear. Peering out of his cave, Scott saw some trees hundreds of feet above shaking violently. Then he saw a black form wander out of nowhere. It was a Himalayan black bear, a wild animal that was known to attack humans unprovoked. Its size alone was threatening. Scott could see death before his eyes. He grabbed the scissors from his pack and waved them at the bear. For what seemed like an eternity, the bear stared at Scott while Scott stared back. After a few minutes, the bear backed off and headed away. It crawled up to the top of the mountain and disappeared among the trees. For the next few nights, the same story repeated itself. After 5 nights of terror, the bear disappeared as mysteriously as it had come. It had decided to look elsewhere for easier prey. Below the mountain in Kathmandu, the rescue operation was making no progress. Officials were very disappointed and frustrated that they had found no signs at all of the missing Australian student for so long. Some began to speculate that Scott may have been kidnapped or murdered by some of the outlaws that hide out in the lawless mountains. One woman who knew the Scott family turned to a supposed psychic in China, and that prophet claimed that Scott was being held against his will on the mountain at Kazankud. This information threw in some extra confusion and did nothing to improve the situation. Ingo Schnabel of the Himalayan Rescue Dogs Training Center suspected that there was something more sinister behind Scott's disappearance. He believed that some of the owners of the small guest houses in the mountains were hiding the truth when they claimed they had not seen James Scott return. Perhaps they were afraid of being connected somehow to the incident. Eventually, the Scott family decided to raise the reward being offered to 100,000 rupees if he was found alive, while the amount for finding him dead stayed at 10,000 rupees. Robertson refused to give up and managed to bring in virtually every private helicopter in Nepal to assist in the search. She dispatched them to fly over various sections of the mountains where her brother might be. One of the helicopters she retained belonged to Colonel Pan, who was recognized as the best pilot in all of Nepal. He agreed to do whatever he could to help find James Scott. Through all this, Robertson never forgot the reported sighting by the Canadians and the counterclaim of the German climber, Matthias. For days, Robertson sat in the office of the Nepalese Immigration Department, searching among the records of tourists, their names, addresses, and passport numbers. She began looking out for Germans whose name began with an M, and eventually she found documentation for a man named Matthias Wigelt. It included his phone number at home in Germany. Robertson immediately picked up the phone and called Wigelt. He confirmed that he had been hiking on the mountain trails in Nepal, and he recalled meeting the Canadian group. Now Robertson could finally discount the story that her brother James had been seen on the Halambu Trail. It was clear that the report had been based on incorrect information. No one had yet learned the fate of Mark Fulton, though. One of the reasons why Ingo Schnabel was so angry at the guest house owners was that they all insisted that they had never seen Mark Fulton. Since Tim Hooper had clearly stated that Fulton had been with them, Schnabel suspected that the Nepalese were not being honest. On January 16th, after weeks of sifting through immigration records, Robertson was stunned to come across Fulton's exit papers. They stated that Fulton had just flown out from Kathmandu and was now on his way to Bangkok. So Fulton had survived the blizzard after all. Even though he had pressed further on as the snow began, Fulton had been fortunate to reach the peak of the mountain. He then descended the other side until he reached a village. Robertson immediately contacted the Australian embassy in Bangkok and arranged for local officials to meet him as soon as his plane landed. He would be ordered to call the Australian embassy in Bangkok at once. When Fulton did so, the embassy in Bangkok put him through to Joanne Robertson. Fulton told Robertson that he had indeed been with her brother James until the snow began and they parted ways. He also gave her the critical information that he and Scott had pressed further than petty. They had remained there overnight and separated later after having gone some distance past the village. Now Robertson rushed to tell rescuer Carl Harrison, who agreed to send up a new team that would search in the area of Petty. He warned her, however, that the weather could prevent the team from accomplishing their task. Unfortunately, not only did the team members not find any trace of Scott, they themselves became stranded in a storm that broke out on January 23rd. They spent the night under harrowing conditions. On January 27th, 36 days after Scott's ordeal began, the last rescue team returned to Kathmandu empty-handed. Most people would probably have given up at this point, but Robertson refused to accept defeat. She pressured Harrison to continue trying. Although she had heard from a Nepalese tour guide that there was an unmarked path towards Taloo, Harrison and the other Himalayan experts had rejected its existence. Harrison insisted that it was not possible that James Scott had used that path because it was completely illogical. The way was blocked by innumerable obstacles, including cliffs and waterfalls that dropped dozens of feet, tall mountains, and deep valleys. According to Harrison, even a professional mountain climber would find the trail to Taloo daunting. In fact, he himself had once gotten lost on that trail and was only found after Schnabel came searching for him with bloodhounds. At this point, Robertson was forced to face the likelihood that her brother James was no longer alive. She finally took the step of booking a return ticket to Australia. Andrew Ross, the family friend who had flown to Nepal to help in the search, had already returned to Australia a few days earlier. He had informed Robertson's parents that their son Scott had not been found and was now presumed dead. On the 33rd day of his ordeal, in the Himalayan wilderness, James Scott heard the sound of a chopper's blades approaching. As the sound drew nearer, he could clearly make out the distinct helicopter sound. He stood there and waved his sleeping bag in one hand and a red shirt in the other. The helicopter sped by and continued on in what Scott figured was the direction of Petty. But then it turned around and began circling the entire area again and again. Several times it seemed as if the helicopter's nose dipped to point directly at Scott, though the aircraft was 8 miles away. After a while, the helicopter turned and flew away, with no indication that the people inside had seen Scott. The sight of the helicopter disappearing in the distance was a terrible blow for Scott. On the third day, a helicopter appeared in the sky again. Scott waved with his arms and legs, jumping up and down in the snow like a lunatic. The helicopter just circled around for a while and then turned and flew away. Although Scott had not eaten anything for 30 days, and he knew his time was numbered, he remained fully conscious and of clear mind. He had lost a lot of weight, and his body was now burning up the protein in his muscles to stay alive. But Scott knew that he could not last much longer like this. Eventually, the body would start digesting itself, generating toxins that would kill him. The last thing he wanted to do was die a skeletal heap. It just seemed so undignified. Strangely enough, the awful hunger pangs that had gnawed at him so much during his first days in the wilderness had long since left him. Weak though he was, Scott had not turned ill. He read the books he had brought with him again and again. On one occasion, a letter he had written was carried away by the wind, and Scott struggled to race after it and bring it back. One day, though, Scott awoke with a bad infection in his throat. He had a cold and his nose was completely congested. Scott could feel his life ebbing away. His body was preparing to give way, while outside the snow continued to fall. He decided that the next day, the 40th according to his calculations, he would leave his cave and head toward Gopti. He was not going to lie there and wait for death to overtake him. Scott calculated that Gopti must be about 4 miles to the north. He figured he could cover a bit over a mile a day. The Australian decided to leave behind his first aid kit and most of his extra clothes. His backpack was now down to 10 or 12 pounds, but he still collapsed under its weight. Using his last bit of energy, Scott dragged himself from the cave and began the long trek. It took 2 hours to cover just 300 feet. During the last half hour, he began vomiting clear water. When Scott took a look around him, he noticed that the sky was darkening with menacing black clouds. Another snow was about to fall. For the first time in several weeks, Scott was overcome by despair. Freezing to death in a snowstorm did not seem like a pleasant option. He opted instead to head back toward the shelter he had occupied for the past 2 weeks. There he could await his end in relative comfort. When he finally reached the cave, Scott put on a dry change of clothes and crept inside his sleeping bag. His feet were swollen, and an ulcer in his mouth made it feel like he was carrying a stone in his throat. And finally, the hunger began to eat at him again. In a last-ditch effort, Robertson asked Harrison to send a helicopter over the unmarked path to Toulouse. Harrison finally agreed, and on February 2nd, he sent a helicopter in that direction. The aircraft was piloted by Colonel Pan, Nepal's most experienced pilot. Robertson drove to the airport in Kathmandu, where the helicopter was scheduled to land on its return. She waited in the radio room at the base to listen in on the conversation between the flight crew and the controllers on the ground. After he returned to the cave, Scott did not even drink any water. The following day, he read one of his books for the 6th time. He was exhausted like never before, and all he could do was suck on a small ball of ice. At least it took his mind off of his suffering. When Scott awoke the next morning, he felt lightheaded and dizzy. He could not stand up or even think straight. Instead, he curled up again in his sleeping bag and drifted off into a fitful rest. That afternoon, a fresh snow fell, but the stranded Australian no longer cared. He didn't even make much of an effort to protect himself from the cold. Unfortunately, the sweet dream evaporated, and Scott awoke to find himself back in the snowy wasteland of the Himalayas. Still, his dream encouraged Scott somewhat, and he now regretted his gloomy thoughts of the night before. He should not have allowed himself to fall into such despair. Then he heard the rhythm of a helicopter. He stood up suddenly, ready to run outside, when suddenly everything turned black. For 10 seconds, Scott felt faint and could see nothing. Even after his vision returned, the dizziness would not let up. He dragged himself out of the cave and waved the sleeping bag in the air. Scott could not see the helicopter in the sky, but he could hear it circling overhead again and again. At one point, it approached within 400 feet of him. Dizzy and weak, Scott could not maintain his balance any longer. He keeled over and fell into the snow. And then the helicopter flew away. Scott felt that he had done everything in his power to save himself, and he began to crawl back to his shelter. But then he heard the noise of the rotors return. He did not have the strength to drag the sleeping bag with him, but Scott crawled back to the empty field and waved his arms at the sky. The helicopter dropped to just 300 feet above him. Scott could not focus his eyes, but after a while, he noticed someone waving at him from the window of the helicopter. Now he knew for sure that he had been seen, but Scott was still skeptical that they would be able to rescue him. Joanne Robertson sat in the control center at the heliport reading a book. Around 20 or 30 minutes into the flight, the radio suddenly came alive. It was Colonel Pan saying that they had found a living person above Toulouse, and they believed it to be James. The man had a blue sleeping bag, but that did not help much with identifying him. Robertson had no idea what color sleeping bag her brother had taken with him. Carl Harrison told her that they had tried to photograph the man from the air, but it had been impossible to get a clear image. The rescuers had not planned to lower men from the helicopter because it would be a very dangerous operation to try. Now, however, Harrison realized that it would take time to reach the man on foot, and the chances of him surviving until then were extremely low. There was no choice but to go back and try to rescue the stranded man from the air. The rescue workers immediately packed their equipment. They also filled the bag with food, medicine, and painkillers. In minutes, the helicopter was back in the air on its way toward Toulouse. But before they could reach their destination, the skies clouded over, and it became impossible to continue. Colonel Pan told Harrison he would wait a few hours and try again. When the clouds failed to break, Harrison decided that they would have to go in on foot instead. That night, Scott lay motionless in his sleeping bag. The stillness of the early morning was suddenly broken by the sound of human voices. At first, Scott thought he was dreaming. He lifted his head slightly and listened closely. He shouted as loud as he could. A voice called back in response. The voices continued calling back to him, drawing nearer the whole time. Scott was too weak to stand up. Suddenly, he saw the shadows of 2 Nepalese men fall across the mouth of his cave. As soon as they saw him, they ran over and asked, "Are you James Scott from Australia?" One of the men told Scott, "No one has ever survived here for more than 10 days, and you've survived for 42 days. Soon the other rescuers arrived, Carl Harrison with them. Harrison gave Scott some fresh, warm clothes, and they got a fire going to warm Scott up a bit. Then they gave him a bit of water. It was 6:30 a.m. at the heliport, and Robertson was there when Colonel Pan radioed in the good news that the man on the mountain was James Scott. Pan informed Robertson that the rescue team would carry Scott down to Toulouse. There he would be loaded onto a helicopter that would fly him to Kathmandu. He would be met by an embassy van that had been specially converted into a temporary ambulance for this operation to rush him to the hospital. When the helicopter landed at Kathmandu, a delegation from the Australian embassy was waiting with Robertson to greet him. But when Robertson got her first glimpse of her brother, she could not believe this was James. He was filthy and seemed to have aged tremendously. In spite of his terrible condition, Scott managed to leave the helicopter on his own 2 feet.
Had James Scott's sister, Joanne Robertson, not stubbornly insisted on one last try that winter, if she had agreed to wait for spring instead, they would have tragically discovered the body of a man who had survived for weeks on his own. Instead, he still lives today and has done important work in the field of child and adolescent psychiatry. James Scott survived 6 weeks. That's 42 days without food, against all odds. Contrary to all expectations, he pulled through. Indeed, when it's decreed in heaven to live, a person will live.